everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us for today's Energy Code ACE webinar, 2025 Codebreaker, Multifamily Ventilation. As you get settled, please feel free to say hello and where you're joining from in the chat today. A few reminders before we get started. Please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen for any questions today, and remember to be constructive in any of those questions or comments to the presenter and to one another to ensure we have a session that is productive. Today's session qualifies for one AIA HSW learning unit, and AIA California will report this unit for those who complete the session live. And as always, the webinar content and additional resources will be available online shortly after the session. To qualify for continuing education credit, AIA California provides learning objectives for every webinar and includes them in the presentation that can be made available online. Now to quickly introduce our presenter. Nick Brown is a certified energy analyst and serves on the board of directors of the California Association of Building Energy Consultants. He is a subject matter expert on the California Building Energy Efficiency Standards, Title 24, Part 6, or the Energy Code, and teaches multiple classes sponsored by Energy Code ACE. He holds a BA in economics from Princeton University and an MBA in manufacturing from the University of Michigan. Nick remodeled his own home in 2014 in a deep energy retrofit and has written and presented extensively on net zero buildings, high performance walls, and energy efficient buildings. Nick, thank you so much for being here today, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. You predicted it. This crowd's from all over the place. There's more people from out of state than in state, I think. But what we're going to cover today is California Energy Code. So hopefully you folks in Illinois will still be able to get something out of it. And we're focused today on multifamily ventilation. To me, one of the most impactful changes in the 2025 code cycle change that you'll see. So we made this special code breaker session, 1 hour that we can dive into this one topic in some depth together. And I want to say, used my house that Sarah just mentioned, I remodeled in 2014. I have a heat recovery ventilator installed in this house. I'll talk to you about how that came to be. And when I built the ADU behind me, put in an energy recovery ventilator in that unit as well. So trying to gather data points from my own personal experience too when it comes to ventilation, because this is a real area of interest of mine. If you supplied your AIA number, AIA California is going to process that for you automatically. So we'll cover first why indoor air quality matters and why it's regulated as part of the California Energy Code. We'll talk about what the 25 code is going to require of ventilation systems in your multifamily buildings, as well as local exhaust requirements. And then we'll cover some best practices. But first, Energy Code ACE is the California statewide compliance improvement program. It's managed by people at PG&E and SCE and SDG&E. And our offerings are really meant to smooth your interaction with the Energy Code, remove some friction and difficulty there. Everything's written in plain English and layman's terms because this code language can be difficult to understand. So we've got tools like these, Reference ACE, which is a keyword search term, Virtual Compliance Assistant, which is an online TurboTax style interface to do your own prescriptive compliance forms for free. And really, these 1 hour code breakers, we're trying to leave breadcrumbs for you to the longer offerings. We've got classes for single family architects, we've got classes for non-residential architects, and classes on all kinds of topics from solar and battery to mechanical systems. In fact, that reminds me, Sarah reminded me that in April, our next session is going to be by Brian Selby on the solar and battery requirements in the 25 Energy Code. So I encourage you to tune in for that too. We even have small bite videos on our YouTube channel now, designed for today's short attention span, no more than 5 minutes, on key topics. So you might find those fun and useful. And then our fact sheets, interpret and summarize the energy code requirements in a way that you might find more user-friendly than the code language itself. So I encourage you to visit energycodeace.com and dig into more of that. As we go through today, some of what we're going to talk about are mandatory requirements, and you'll see the gavel icon if we're doing that. Because mechanical ventilation systems are a health and safety item, they fall in this category, mandatory requirements. Other parts of what we're going to talk about today are prescriptive standards, like the requirement for heat recovery in certain climate zones and situations. We'll use the RX icon when we're talking about that. And of course, most multifamily projects, as well as single family, use the performance method for showing compliance, which allows trade-offs among these prescriptive standards. And if we're talking about something that's a performance modeling credit, we'll show you the scale icon so you know what we're talking about. I've got the Q&A box up in front of me. So as we get going, please put your questions in real time, and I like to jump on them right then. But I'm not monitoring the chat, so you guys can chatter away to your heart's content in that window. So first, let's cover why the energy code regulates indoor air quality at all. Then we'll cover the code requirements for ventilation, best practices, and sum up. The 2025 Energy Code in California is named that, but it went into effect January 1st, 2026. Any projects applying for permit on or after that date need to meet the 25 code. And we've given you a link here to the CEC's official documents. We're going to circulate at the end of this presentation a PDF workbook containing all these slides. So you'll have those links. So why does the Energy Code regulate indoor air quality? Well, we're building our homes much tighter than before. We're spending perhaps more of our time indoors than before, by some estimates, 90%. And we're always bringing in pollutants, toxins from outside every time we enter a building on our shoes. We're creating pollutants when we cook, when we shower, in the form of moisture and other materials. We buy a new couch, that's foam based. We get that's going to off gas to some extent. So toxins can build up in a really tight building and cause health problems. And ventilation has been established now for a long time as the best solution to ensuring indoor air quality is healthy. And here in California, we have somewhat of an asthma challenge. 1 in 7 Californians at some point in their life report asthma symptoms. There's a direct linkage between indoor air quality and respiratory conditions like asthma. So healthy indoor air is critical to sensitive populations to ensure that they're functioning well in our buildings, staying healthy, functioning on a high cognitive level. And I like to start out with this because we think about our buildings in terms of serving a practical function, right? Spaces for us to do our work, sleep, eat, watch TV. But they're also, our buildings have a big impact on our cognitive performance. This study from Harvard tested people's cognitive abilities at various CO2 concentrations. That's across the x-axis here. And you can see as CO2 concentration increases to the right of each chart, the students' performance on challenging tasks declines significantly. Information usage, strategy. So when we think about designing buildings, whether they're office buildings where people are going to be testing their cognitive abilities, or homes where people are increasingly working from home and needing that high cognitive performance level, well, ensuring indoor air quality can seem really important and should. This Harvard study found that reduced ventilation caused the higher CO2 concentration, of course, which brought down people's ability to think and perform higher order analysis 60%. And the CEC, in defending their upgrades to IAQ standards, said increasing ventilation rates will reduce respiratory illness and associated sick leave, sick building symptoms, and increase productivity. During COVID, there was a lot of questions about our ventilation systems in buildings, right? And I found this study really interesting, giving you a link to it here as well. They found that upgrading existing building ventilations to code requirements was equivalent to vaccinating 50 to 60% of the occupants of that building against the flu in terms of avoiding sickness. So I like that study. It really indicates to me the power of meeting these indoor air quality codes. And we all know many of our existing buildings were built before these indoor air quality whole building ventilation standards were in place, and they could really benefit from upgrades like this. I definitely heard a lot of chatter about increasing airflow rates above the minimum during COVID, filtering the return air, and using some of these additional methods to clean the air. So the Energy Code has long recognized three main approaches to ventilating buildings: exhaust, supply, and balance. Let's look at each real quickly. In the supply configuration, a fan is bringing in outdoor air and blowing it into the conditioned space, so the stale air is assumed to leave the building through leaks in the building envelope. This creates a slightly positive pressure environment. In the exhaust scenario, which is the most common scenario, I would argue, the fan direction's reversed. The exhaust fan is pulling stale air out of the building, and fresh air is assumed to leak in through holes in the building envelope. This creates a slightly negative pressure environment. And in a balanced ventilation system, neutral pressure is maintained in the building, generally perceived to be a more comfortable pressure for people. And this is accomplished by an exhaust fan and a supply fan running concurrently. In this exhibit shown here, this graphic, we're showing what looks like a heat recovery ventilator style, a balanced ventilation system where the exhaust and supply fan are integral in one box. But we can also accomplish balanced ventilation with a supply and exhaust fan separate from one another, such as shown here. And in a multifamily setting, these can be central exhaust systems and central supply systems running together, serving each dwelling unit. These two can create neutral pressure. So the big headline of the 25 code cycle is in our multifamily dwelling units, exhaust ventilation will no longer be permitted. As I said before, this is a mandatory measure, so there's no getting around it. So we'll talk about the implications of that. We're going to be left with supply and balanced ventilation as our options. In the past code cycle, the 2022 code cycle, multifamily builders had the choice of two approaches. They could use exhaust ventilation in multifamily, but they had to blower door test the envelopes of those units to show that they were tight enough that the exhaust fans would be bringing in fresh air, not your neighbor's stale air. Or you could use balanced or supply ventilation and skip the blower door testing of the units. And I really expected when that code came out builders to choose the balanced or supply ventilation method to avoid the potential uncertainty of failing that blower door test. I was wrong. Most builders that I've come in contact with over the past few years chose to continue to ventilate their multifamily building dwelling units via exhaust and did that blower door test. But that's no longer going to be an option under the current 2025 code. So let me get to Michael's question in just a minute. These are some quotes from the case report that the Energy Commission publishes. The case process is when new measures are considered. A group of experts writes a report evaluating the pros and cons, and there's a public process. Encourage all of you to get involved with that if you're interested. But here's why the Energy Commission put forth that balanced ventilation with blower door testing requirement for this code cycle. The primary goal is to reduce pollutant transfer with adjacent units, which is reported to be a common complaint by tenants. The requirement for mechanically driven supply air will ensure that ventilation air comes from outdoors rather than neighboring units. And compartmentalization, that's the ensuring the sealing of the envelope, reduces pollutant transfer between adjacent units, thereby improving indoor air quality, reducing odor and noise transfer. So that's why under the 25 code, we're looking at balanced ventilation required or supply and blower door testing to ensure that the envelope of our dwelling units is tight. We like to pause periodically and let you guys get involved. What options for indoor air quality ventilation are permissible under the 2025 Energy Code for new multifamily dwelling units? All right. Supply and balanced. Only options. Yeah, Michael, I think let's get through this next section and talk more about ASHRAE 62.2 and the pros and cons of these various requirements. We're going to cover the code requirements right now. First, 160.2, this is a mandatory requirement, requires all new multifamily dwelling units to have continuously operating mechanical ventilation. That's removing toxins that are accumulating in our space, right? And we can have an intermittent system if we want, but that system needs to basically function moving the same amount of air as a continuously operating one anyway. There's really no energy savings to going intermittent, so most buildings tend to use continuously operating systems. And there's only two methods that are possible, supply and balanced. Common use areas, of course, are subject to the non-residential section of the energy code, so they'll need to meet their own mandatory ventilation requirements separate from dwelling units. And as Michael said, these ventilation requirements are aligned with ASHRAE 62.2. And you'll see in this chart here that multifamily dwelling units of different sizes, their indoor air quality CFM scales up according to the number of bedrooms and the square footage. Also a requirement that the sound rating of these fans that are going to be operating continuously be 1 zone or less. This, by the way, also applies if you're adding an ADU to an existing multifamily building, adding an ADU to a single family home. that triggers indoor air quality ventilation for new dwelling units. Now, the compartmentalization testing needs to be done for each dwelling unit, and the code says the tested air leakage rate can't exceed 0.3 CFM per square foot of dwelling unit envelope surface area. So a dwelling unit has 6 sides typically, right? Floor, roof, and walls. So let's take this one bedroom, 744 square foot example in this floor plan. The total surface area of that dwelling unit comes to about 2,400 square feet. So that blower door test is going to need to come in under 720 CFM of leakage at 50 pascals of pressure. So you'll have, we used to call these specialists HERS raters who do this testing. They're now known as EC raters, Energy Code Compliance raters, who will come out and do that blower door test for your units. So 2 things mandatory: balanced or supply ventilation and compartmentalization testing. So with supply and balanced ventilation systems, we've, for a few code cycles now, required MERV 13 filtration on the supply leg of balanced ventilation systems and supply systems. This is because California has air quality challenges, especially with PM 2.5 diesel particulates. So this helps ensure that those pollutants never get in our spaces, because MERV 13 filters are ideally designed to pull out PM 2.5 as well as bacteria and viruses. This MERV 13 filtration requirement is the same for ducted HVAC returns, by the way. So I see this as a real value add when you architects are remodeling, doing a deep retrofit of an existing home, changing out that HVAC system, putting in MERV 13 filtration on the ducted returns, maybe putting in supply or balanced ventilation with MERV 13 filtration on that. You can show that client just how much healthier you've made the IAQ in that building. Really should be seen, I think, as a boost to cognitive performance, quality of sleep, as we looked at in some of those studies. Also required in our multifamily buildings is local exhaust fans. This is separate from the whole dwelling unit indoor air quality fans. These are here to be on demand, operated typically like a kitchen range hood, turned on when cooking, turned off when not in use, and the bathrooms turned on when taking a shower, turned off when complete. 50 CFM is the requirement if on demand, but note that there's a 20 CFM allowance for continuously operating local exhaust fans. I'll give you an example in my ADU of where that was really convenient. We put an energy recovery ventilator into the ADU for their IAQ whole dwelling unit fan. And so by ensuring we had 20 CFM running continuously in the bathroom, we didn't need a separate bathroom exhaust fan. This did get a comment from the local building department, but I was able to show them in the code where this is provided for. Now, the kitchen range vent hood has a table that was new in the last code cycle that specifies, based on the dwelling unit floor area, how many CFM is required for that range. And note that higher airflow is required with natural gas ranges than electric ranges. So in our classes, Energy Code ACE, we encourage architects to include this table in their plan sets with a box around the minimum CFM that applies to your project. Yeah, Michael asks about makeup air for kitchen range vent hoods. The Energy Code doesn't address makeup air. So if that's addressed in the mechanical code, that's where you'd go to find that. I sometimes see local building departments asking for that, but usually only when that kitchen range vent hood is really high airflow to where they expect that to be a problem. So we also have to make sure that balanced and supply ventilation with that filter for MERV 13 is accessible for maintenance. This part of the code anticipates that long after that building's built, those occupants are going to need to change their filters, right? On my HRVs, it's about every 6 months, but that could be highly variable depending on where these buildings are located. So the air filters, and if using heat recovery, the HRV, ERV cores need to be accessible for service from occupiable spaces. And if they're behind access panels, they need to be no more than 10 feet above a walking surface. So that's going to be a challenge on our multifamily buildings. Fault indicator displays are now triggered in certain cases in the code. Let's say we can't meet that maintenance access requirement we just looked at within 10 feet of occupiable spaces. We have an option to put the system in the attic as long as it's equipped with an FID to alert the occupants that something's wrong, filters blanked over or the motors given out, because otherwise that could be hidden from view and the important IAQ function of that system not operating without the knowledge of the occupants. The attic access door has to include an integrated ladder and a walkway from the door to the site of the maintenance. So this is a mandatory requirement if your ventilation system's put up in the attic. We can also have FID triggered as a prescriptive standard if we're installing an HRV, ERV to satisfy our IAQ requirement. Now remember, prescriptive standards are very different from mandatory requirements. And I had a HRV manufacturer contact me. Oh my gosh, we don't have an FID with our unit. We can't sell it in California. I said, well, that's not right. It's okay to not meet all prescriptive standards. It'll just mean you get less compliance credit than if you had an FID under the performance method. It does mean that you can't comply via the prescriptive pathway, but most projects use the performance pathway anyway. And I ran a bunch of runs for them in the modeling software, found that the FID part of the credit was about 10% of the credit on a typical HRV. So I was able to tell them, you're still getting 90% of the credit for having that HRV. You can still sell your product in California without an FID, but you're going to get full credit if you have it. That makes sense? I know the fact that there's two FID requirements, one mandatory, one prescriptive, and both triggered only in certain cases is a little bit much to understand. Single family ventilation requirements, you're still allowed exhaust. Good question. Still allowed exhaust supply or ventilation, no prescriptive requirement on heat recovery. You see, and that brings up a good point. The multifamily situation is unique with shared walls, stale air next to your dwelling unit. That's why exhaust ventilation is seen as just not a valid method for ensuring the health of the occupants. Whereas in a single family home, completely different. Julie, the FID could be sold with it, could be sold separately, but the important thing is if you're if your ventilation system's up in the attic, the FID has to be there when the EC does the verifications, when the inspector comes to make sure, check up on everything. Can you put filter access at the ceiling? Absolutely. Yeah. And I'd say that'd be a best practice on the ceiling or out on a balcony where it's entirely accessible. All right. Now in the area of prescriptive requirements on ventilation, we've left the land of what's mandatory, supply or balance ventilation. Now we're focused on what's prescriptive standard. Well, guess what? Heat recovery is prescriptive standard in multifamily dwelling units in these colored climate zones, 1, 2, 4, 11 through 14, and 16. And I bet some of you architects work in these climate zones, right? Because this includes San Jose, it includes Paso Robles, it includes the whole Central Valley, Palmdale, and the Sierras. Generally, the climate zones with more heating load are the ones where HRVs are most beneficial and save energy. So if you build a multifamily building, not only do you have to meet the mandatory requirements to have supply or balanced ventilation, but in these climate zones, you have to have heat recovery. If you're complying via the prescriptive method, you've got to have an HRV meeting these requirements. You can use the performance method and not put in heat recovery in these climate zones, but you'll take a penalty, right? That you need to make up for with other features. And we've given you a link to the helpful CEC Climate Zone Finder. Allows you to put in an address and it'll tell you definitively what climate zone that is. And if you want to use supply, not balance, you've got to use the performance approach. So back to local exhaust. Do you remember which rooms in a multifamily dwelling unit need to have local exhaust? Yeah, bathrooms and kitchens, right? And in what climate zones are recovery ventilators prescriptively required? It's these heating dominated climate zones, 1, 2, 4, 11 through 14, and 16. So for these reasons, I got to think heat recovery ventilators, which are balanced ventilation systems in one appliance with heat recovery, are going to really make strides in this next few years as we're designing multifamily buildings to meet this new 25 code. Of course, I said that last code cycle and I was dead wrong. Question earlier was minimum distance from the ERV to operable windows and doors. There are definitely some code requirements in the mechanical code on a recovery ventilator is going to have an exhaust duct and a supply duct. And there's some requirements on how close those can be to one another so that they're not short circuiting. I'm guessing that's what you're referring to. May also be requirements that there are certain distance from window and doors, but sorry, I don't know that offhand. All right, I thought we've covered the code requirements now. I thought I'd move on and talk about some best practices in installing these systems. First, I get this question a lot because there's these two varieties of recovery ventilators, ERVs and HRVs, and there's a lot of building science websites out there that homeowners and architects are doing research on continuously, and you're going to get all kinds of opinions on ERV versus HRV. I like Allison Bale's answer from his recent book. The choice between an ERV and an HRV should land on ERV most of the time. It's only in mild climates where it doesn't get too cold, humid, or dry where HRVs make sense. And guess what? That type of climate is a lot of California. So for this reason, I don't overly fixate on HRV versus ERV, but the difference is HRVs just swap heat. And I'll show you a diagram on this in a minute to help you understand what it means in practice. They just swap heat. So the outgoing stale air, which you've conditioned to your desired temperature, is allowed to swap heat with the incoming outside air. And that saves on your heating and cooling energy use. ERVs swap heat and moisture between those two airstreams. Airstreams aren't crossing with each other so that, odors are still going to leave, but they're able to swap moisture and heat, and that can have a differential impact on the humidity inside your building. Sometimes it's advantageous to swap that moisture. Sometimes it's not, depending on the situation outside. But anyway, ERV is probably the best choice. So let's look at how these work a little bit. In the winter scenario, let's say it's 40 degrees outside and our indoor temperature is about 70. Well, the stale air from the home goes into our heat recovery core at 70 degrees and it swaps heat with that 40-degree air. Not 100%, but that recovery effectiveness metric is to what degree the heat gets swapped. So in this example, let's say that 40-degree air gets warmed up to 60 degrees in the HRV before it comes into your house. So you see how that reduces the burden on your HVAC system to heat your house during winter. Instead of a steady stream of, let's say, 50 or 100 CFM of 40-degree air, you're getting a steady stream of 60-degree air. In summer, 100-degree outside air might come in at 86 instead of 100, reducing the cooling energy required in your house. So that's where the energy savings of HRVs, ERVs come from. And as I mentioned before, they're balanced ventilation systems in a box. So they're convenient ways, and some of them are quite compact and can fit in, ceiling framing, wall framing. Others you're going to need to install in a laundry closet or something. In large single family homes, often they'll go in a mechanical room. And in the ERV scenario, we're going to be swapping the moisture from the stale air to the fresh air. Note that generally the stale air ducts are connected to bathrooms and kitchens, sources of moisture, and the fresh air ducts are connected to bedrooms and living spaces. The scenario I'll share from COVID was my daughter was in high school. She wanted to have some friends around during COVID, so she took over this office, and the three of them did their schoolwork here. And I, being a building science nerd, had an air quality monitor in here, and I was noticing the CO2 levels were going up above 1,000 CFM, 1,000 parts per million. So I decided then, hey, I might as well walk the walk, and I put in an HRV. I located it up in the attic, and I put about 30 CFM of fresh filtered air into this office, and that took care of the problem. Also added ducts to the primary bedroom, the living room, and another bedroom. Put exhaust ducts in the bathroom and the kitchen, and it's been working great. I just climb up in the attic to change the filter every now and then and wish I'd installed it somewhere more convenient. Yeah, Julie asks about a small ERV that doesn't have ducting. Yeah, absolutely. That meets the energy code requirements for recovery ventilators. The ducting is not required. The ducting is a best practice to get the fresh air and stale air distributed better inside our homes. Because when I think about exhaust ventilation in a large dwelling unit, for instance, one bathroom fan running over here, 100 feet away is the living space. How well are we really ensuring that fresh air is distributed in a big space like that? So the ducting becomes more critical in larger dwelling units, in my opinion. But absolutely, you can do what through the wall or unducted units and still meet these code requirements. Here's a quick chart from my ADU. This is a period of about 6 months, summer to winter. So on the left side of the chart in blue, you see the outdoor fresh air temperatures coming to my ERV. They go up almost to 100 degrees, down to about 60. And the red is the supply air to inside. So notice how the supply air is maintaining 75, 80, 85 degrees, even when we hit those extremes. And then in winter, it never goes below about 65, the supply air, even though we're dropping into the 40s. That's what an HRV will do for you. And here's a diagram of the ducting when you use that. Typically, fresh supply air into living and bedroom spaces, stale exhaust air from wet rooms like bathrooms and kitchens. Now, we've done a number of modeling studies to determine the energy savings of these units. And recovery ventilators average 15% boost in the performance approach for compliance. More in climate zones with high heating loads like 1 through 5, less in milder and hotter climate zones like 6 through 10 and 15. And the credit increases with higher recovery effectiveness, more efficient fans, and more airflow, up to 125% of the energy code minimum requirement where it's capped. Okay. You also get that added 10% if it's equipped with an FID. And we did a study for SoCal Gas that we've given you a link to here that looked at the energy savings of various HRVs, best in class and typical by different climate zones. So if you're interested, encourage you to check that out. So let's say we're using the performance method. We're in a climate zone where HRVs are prescriptively required in multifamily dwellings. Like let's say we're in climate zone 12, Sacramento. Look on this chart, it's worth over 15% compliance credit there. So if we choose not to install it, that's the compliance penalty we're going to have to make up for with other feature upgrades. That makes sense? Julie, do you need one per room? No, not necessarily. If you meet the cubic feet per minute of the indoor air quality requirement of the code with a single unit, you're done. But I find that there's one called Lunos as well that's pairs that go through the wall. They're only like 20 CFM per pair. So you may need a couple or three pairs to get up to that minimum fresh air requirement for a dwelling unit, let's say. But there's no requirement that you have it in each room. I included a few slides here we won't go into too much detail on, but just to show you the compliance metrics for 25 have changed. They were TDV energy for new construction. They're now long-term system cost. So you'll see a slightly different performance compliance summary on your forms than you're used to. Here's what's in each of those metrics. Note that if you work in single family, they added a fourth compliance metric called peak cooling this code cycle. That doesn't apply to multifamily though. So HRVs and ERVs can meet are mandatory whole house indoor air quality fan requirement. They can also meet those prescriptive standards for HRVs, ERVs in certain climate zones, and they can meet mandatory local bathroom exhaust fan requirements like I did in my ADU. So pretty handy ventilation systems in a box. Now, some of the more advanced units might come with a boost mode. So when it senses high humidity, it ramps up to a higher airflow. Or you have 20 people over, it senses higher CO2, it ramps up its airflow then too. Pretty cool. And some have summertime bypass feature. Sometimes it's not advantageous to swap the heat of the incoming air. Maybe you're in summer and it's cool outside. You're better off just bringing in that fresh air without swapping heat, and you can do that with systems equipped with that feature. So one last question, how much performance compliance credit is possible for multifamily projects using ERVs, HRVs? 15%, depending on climate zone. Significant. And what are some other benefits of recovery ventilators? Yeah, we mentioned all of those. Okay, energy consultant implied energy recovery doesn't work in San Francisco because of narrow seasonal and diurnal temperature swings. Boy, anytime you've got a temperature differential across your envelope that's not beneficial, a recovery ventilator is going to be beneficial. So I would disagree with that statement. And to go back to this chart, Climate Zone 3 is San Francisco, and it was one of the best performing with biggest savings climate zones. It's not, if the weather in San Francisco stayed 70 year round, then that statement would probably be true, but it doesn't, right? There's enough of a differential where that heat recovery functions beneficial. All right, so we've got a bunch of fact sheets on Energy Code ACE. What's new for multifamily buildings? We've got single family and non-res versions of those fact sheets, all available for free download on the Energy Code ACE website. We've got longer training offerings. We'd love to see you in. What's new for the various occupancy types. We've got a new class coming, multifamily standards for energy consultants. And if you don't find the answers there, we've got this FAQ tool we call Q&As. And if you still can't find your question answered, well, you can submit a question to our help desk, and one of the other Energy Code aces, Gina, Brian, or others will respond within 48 hours. I'll share with you my contact information here, as well as that of my manager, Dave Intner, who runs my contract at SCE and was kind enough to sponsor this session today. And I'll leave this up for a bit while I see if there are any final questions, comments. I think we got a few minutes left.
Yeah, thank you, Nick, so much. For those still in the audience with us, which is everyone, haven't seen a drop off. Please feel free to drop your questions for Nick in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We've already had quite a few going in here.
Yeah.
So we'd love to hear from our audience today.
Yeah, especially what's your opinion on the impact of this change? I presented to an engineering firm the other day, and they said this would They thought this would add $1,000 to the cost of a multifamily dwelling unit. Big deal? What do you guys think?
Nick, it looks like there is a new question in the chat, a couple, or excuse me, in the Q&A that are popping up.
Oh, did I miss one?
I think they
Oh,
just rolled
yeah.
in.
Oh, was there a question on blower door testing? I wish I knew the answer to that better. Now, EC testing generally allows for sampling, right? Where rather than testing every single dwelling unit in a building where the dwelling units are largely the same, you can sample. But I believe if you fail enough of those sampled units, you end up testing the whole building. But I'll see if I can get the answer to Sarah so that she can put that in the follow-up email. That's a good question. How to turn off units to obtain the cool night air. Yeah, some of them come with that function automatically incorporated where they have a bypass. So that incoming outdoor air, instead of going through the heat recovery core and swapping its heat with the outgoing air, just goes right around the core and then rejoins the ductwork to distribute as supply air. So it's filtered, but it's not heated up by the indoor air. So sometimes that's beneficial and um, works on the same function as a whole house fan, right? Where you're bringing in cool evening air instead of running your air conditioner for cooling. When will existing large dwelling units need to conform? Oh, no provision for requiring existing buildings to meet this yet. Nice to hear Michael feel like this one-time cost is more than offset by the savings. Yeah, getting the penetrations, Bruce, through the exterior wall will be a challenge for small units because you need an outdoor air and an exhaust stale air. Uh, now, the one I installed for the ADU comes with what's called a pant leg boot, where the supply and the exhaust go into two concentric ducts so that only one uh, penetration through the envelope is required. Now, I don't know if that meets California mechanical code requirements, but just thought I'd make you aware that those exist. How does air tightness and blower door tests align with lead? I don't know the answer to that either. Sorry, anonymous attendee. But I do know blower door tests are commonly required of single family homes in large part of the country. And so building science folks have often um, questioned why California hasn't required air tightness testing on a more wide basis. We've also had comments that exhaust ventilation makes no sense. And so this is the first, well, I'd say the 22 code that made balanced ventilation the pathway that prevented the blower door testing was the first step, and this 25 code's the second step. Are we still required to have a tenant switch to disable the unit on a bad outdoor air quality day? Yeah, we're still supposed to have a manual on-off switch and label that so that people know it's mechanical ventilation and don't turn it off. How much space? Yeah, as I said, some of them fit, especially low CFM units, can fit in I don't know, 2.5, 3 feet by 20 inches type dimension, 8 or 10 or 12 inches of depth. So I've seen some that are designed to fit in existing framing, but there's definitely some larger units that will require, um, you to work around framing or leave some headroom in between floors to get it in there. And then there's the ones that attach to the wall, like that. I think it's a Panasonic unit that isn't ducted and just has that one mounting location. Thanks, Dave. Good point. Yeah, Becky asking about the accessibility of that on-off switch. That code requirement, I think, is that it be in an accessible spot. But having said that, we're allowed to put the HRV up in an attic, right? As long as we have that FID. But presumably that FID in occupiable space would allow you to turn that off and meet that requirement too. Yeah. Thanks for that, Michael. Everyone can see the Q&A, right? So I don't need to repeat Michael's question point. All right. Yeah, CO2 sensors. I've got one that's a moisture sensor, so it automatically ramps up when the moisture in the bathroom exceeds a certain level and then ramps back down afterwards. All right. Hey, love to hear your feedback as you guys figure out what you're going to do on your multifamily designs.
Awesome.
Right at time,
Well,
Sarah. We did it.
yeah, this is great. Thank you so much, Nick, for your presentation today and going through everyone's questions. Thank you to all those that attended today and asked those really great questions. If you've made it this far, AIA California will submit you for AIA credit, and we'll be sending up follow-up information on where you can find the recording that'll be available in the coming days, how you can receive your certificate for today's program, and any upcoming events that we have, and also from Energy Code ACE. So thank you again to everyone, and thank you, Nick, and we hope to see you at our next webinar. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Pleasure. Thanks, Sarah.